Right, I'm going to show what you can do with a pivot table. Thing about pivot tables, when you talk about pivot tables, is that it's either the case that people really get it and they understand what the potential is, or they kind of glaze over. Well, this is going to be in an effort to remove the glaze a little bit. It seems complicated from the outside looking in, but once you get used to it, it's really something very useful. So, first thing, your data needs to be organized in a table. So, what I've got here is a pre-built table with some random data in it. Some data that might be typical for use with the pivot table. This is a table where you've got hypothetical transactions made. Customer ID would be a customer reference within your system. Of course, customer who might come into a store, a date that they might come into a store, transaction that they might make, and then the month and the year based on that sale date. All the data here is organized again in a table. Now, the things that is important about that is that each of these table headings will then translate into fields available for you later on in the pivot, and it'll make sense here in just a second. But as long as your data is organized in this fashion, then you can make use of it inside a pivot table. And all really a pivot table is just a grouping and summarizing of data that allows you to very quickly drill or slice or do some pretty nifty analysis. So once we have the data to work with, why don't we just dive in. Well, it's easy to do a pivot table. Basically just click on insert, click on pivot table. Excel is going to try to assume what the range of data is that you're wanting to work with, and so in this case it guesses that this is the table that we want to use, and that's correct. Once you've got the range of data that you want to use, select either new worksheet or existing worksheet. I'm just going to make an existing worksheet. In this case, we can keep it all on one screen. And with that, I'm going to click on this little icon here to select this area here as the home for our pivot table. Click off on that again. That range is there. Click on OK. And there's your pivot table. We're done. No, I'm kidding. Okay. As I was mentioning a minute ago, each one of these column headings becomes a field available for the pivot. And now you'll see that those pivot fields are available in this pivot field list and this diagram here that is basically the framework for your pivot table. You'll notice down here that you have 4 quadrants. Each one of these quadrants represents something different. The report filter quadrant allows you to filter data based on whatever it is that you've got out there, and I'll kind of demonstrate that in a second. Column labels, if you drop a field into here, which we will in just a second also, that becomes a column in your summary pivot table. Same thing for a row. If you drop one of these fields in here, you'll get a summary available for that row. And then of course here in the lower right column are all the calculations, all the math. Alright, so what we're going to do here is drop in some data. The first thing that we're doing here is to set up the total amount of the data, and we can just verify that this thing is working. Highlight all that. See the amount down here, 24,310, 24,310. So that makes sense. When all you have to do to get the diagram up here, your framework for your pivot table, is just click actually within the pivot table itself. You'll notice that if you click off, that thing goes away. Click on, it comes back on. All right. One thing about pivot tables and format, you can format this the way you normally know how to format. Right click, format, and make it look whatever way you want it to make it look. But if you do that and you go to refresh your data later, it will erase the formatting that is within the pivot table. So in order to create a format that stays there regardless of whether or not you refresh data, the way you want to format it is actually by clicking on this field inside the value section. So just click on it, and that's a normal left click, and select value field settings. Click on number format. Use a choose number, use separator, hit OK, hit OK. So now that format will remain regardless of whether you refresh or not. But as we're kind of moving down the line here, and there's a lot of elaboration that could happen with demonstrating pivot tables, so I'm going to try to keep it basic. What we're looking for here is, or what a pivot table represents, is the ability to again group on data within something that's dynamic. Alright, so let's just kind of demonstrate that a little bit. Let's draw in, and by the way, you notice that all I had to do was drag a field into one of these boxes, and that sets up basically the structure of the pivot table. I'm going to do the same thing here with pulling down the customer. Alright, so you see automatically we got another level of grouping, and that is based on the field that I just pulled down. You'll notice that you now see the sum for each of these customers. That still comes down to our number that's the total. That's all a pivot table really is. So you get that concept, then you can do just about anything else that you can imagine, and there are a lot of things you can do with this thing, but if you get that basic piece, that kind of gets you in the door. So now if this was of course in the row label section. Now if we want to demonstrate the column label section, let's do this, drag that into here. Okay, so now what we did is we said, okay, for all these customers, when were their sales? And now we have subtotals again by month, in this case, and by customer. And these all foot out. That is the biggest thing to get your mind around in pivot tables. What we just did is just understanding that all a pivot table is the ability to structure the output of the data in such a way that it's dynamic and it's able to be digested, I guess you'd say, within different slices. All right. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that you could go from a summary view to detailed views within the construction of a pivot table. And what I meant by that was that you notice how you've got all these great groupings, is by month and so on. At a summary view, one of the things that is pretty neat about a pivot table is that you can actually double click on one of these values and you get all that detail broken out or produced in another sheet, another worksheet. So pretty nifty. Alright, so one more quick thing that I'll do just to kind of keep this thing brief is that a pivot table in and of itself is pretty useful, but there's another feature that you can build out with pivot formulas, get pivot formulas rather, that take the utility of this thing to the next level basically. So for example, if I wanted to build a get pivot formula, and basically a get pivot formula is similar to a VLOOKUP, only it's more dynamic, and it will basically make use and leverage the pivot tables utility to something that just really becomes something very, very useful. So anyway, what you want to do to create a get pivot formula is just hit the equal sign, go into the formula entry mode, and just select any value on your pivot table, and you'll see that there's implied this formula. Now, this formula used to drive me crazy when I was trying to get data out of pivot tables when I was first working with pivot tables, and because I couldn't stand that this formula was just automatically dropped in there until I understood really what was happening and understood the potential with it. Anyway, if I hit enter here, I get a formula and I get my value out there. Now, if I copy this formula, it's going to be the same value over and over and over again. But basically what it's doing is saying, okay, go to the pivot table that is on A2, find the customer John, and give me the sum total of the cell amount. Alright? The way this thing becomes particularly useful is when you've got a formula that says, okay, and this could be in a different sheet or some other reference, obviously, that you're trying to make use of the dynamic kind of nature of pivot tables. what we can do, let's just say we've got a customer here on a different sheet. For whatever reason, we want to go pick out what the summary is for the total amount we've ever sold to this person. When you're building out a pivot table, or get pivot formula rather, you can make this thing dynamic. If you hit equals, you select a cell, you get this by default. You get all these pieces defined in here, but these are formula references. These are variables, so you can actually take these references and replace them with a field. So we just went and made this thing dynamic. All right, let's just do one quick thing here. Just kind of give you a sense of what the potential is here. If I copy that down, you see where we're going with this. You've got that formula that now is dynamic and refers back to this data. Now if you go update this data or refresh this data, of course these values will refresh wherever they are. Alright, thank you for your attention, thank you for watching, and we'll have more of these to come.